So, hello, welcome everyone to the first Ridge virtual shelter-in-place winemaker tasting and roundtable. We have a panel of expert tasters here that are going to share their thoughts about our wines that we've just released. My name is Mark Vernon. I'm the CEO here at Ridge, and we're going to be doing one of these tastings every Thursday at this same time through the month of April. So join us again if you like what you see this time, and meet up with us here every Thursday afternoon for the next several weeks. So first, I'd like to introduce the members of our panel today. And first, I'll introduce Eric Baher, who's Chief Operating Officer and Head Winemaker for our Montebello winery. And I think Eric is joining us from the Montebello winery itself today.
The inner sanctum of the Montebello winery.
Yeah, you're there all by yourself, right?
Yeah, right now.
Yeah, okay. And then next is John Olney, who's our Chief Operating Officer and Head Winemaker for the Lytton Springs Winery. And you're joining us from your office at Lytton Springs, huh, John?
Yep, I am.
And I'm actually in my office at Lytton, a long ways away from John. So we are properly isolated from each other here. And then finally, we have David Gates, who's our Senior Vice President of Vineyard Operations. And Dave is joining us from his home in the famous Peroni Vineyard. So how are you doing, Dave?
Sheltering in place.
Good. All right. Okay. So I think before we get into the actual tasting, I just wanted to give everyone an update on what's happening here at Ridge. We obviously had to start changing our business fairly dramatically last week with the shelter-in-place orders that were issued by both our local counties and then the state of California. Fortunately, Ridge qualifies as an essential business under the guidelines of our health orders. So we are able to continue operations, but we have to do so in a way that's responsible and to mitigate and minimize any chance of spreading the virus amongst our employees. So as a result, for the foreseeable future, our 2 tasting rooms are closed, and a majority of our staff, including sales, customer service, accounting, IT, and administration, have all been working from home since early last week. Our vineyard, winery, and warehouse staff are continuing to come to work each day, but we've done a number of things to ensure their safety. In the warehouse, we've actually gone to a split shift to reduce the number of people working at a given time so we can keep a good separation. Both wineries have also implemented protocols to keep workers separate from each other. We've put a great deal of attention onto sanitation protocols, making sure that we're doing everything we can to really prevent the spread of the virus. I think it's really important for us. Safety of our employees and safety of our customers is absolutely paramount. So just to let you know, we have always provided our employees with full benefits, including paid time off for sick leave specifically. And we've made it very clear to all our employees that if anyone is feeling sick, they need to immediately go home and stay home and not come back to work. Fortunately, our workforce has been healthy, and I'm happy to report so far nobody at Ridge has been sick in any way, let alone has contracted the virus. So we're fortunate that we're able to keep our operations going. Okay, so enough of that. Let's turn to what we're here for today, which is to talk about wine, and specifically the 4 wines that made up the spring release and Z-list shipment. And those of you who are members of the Z-list club, hopefully by now, unless you were a will call customer, all of you should have received your shipments by now. Hopefully, maybe some of you have even pulled a bottle or 2 out to join us in the tasting today. So I think one last thing before we start is just to explain how we're going to try to run the tasting today. And we are doing this as a Zoom webinar, and Zoom provides two features for you to participate. One feature is the chat function, which I can already see is getting a lot of activity right now. Feel free to continue to use the chat, but if you have a question for us, for anyone on the panel, or about Ridge in general, please use the Q&A function and put your and enter your question in the Q&A, and then we'll either pick up on it live and answer it on air, or we may provide a written answer to the question depending on what's going to work the best. So bear with us. This is our first time doing this kind of thing on Zoom. So we're going to learn along with you, hopefully make this a fun and enjoyable experience. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to John Olney, who's going to start with the first two wines and tell you a little bit about those and go from there. All right, John?
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today in this sort of unique venue. The first one we'll start with is the 2018 East Bench, and a little bit of just a little bit of background on the wine. As a lot of the viewers probably know, Ridge has a lot of history in terms of Zinfandel in general, and more specifically up here in Sonoma County. We first came to Sonoma County in the 60s and started making the Geyserville, which we'll be tasting here just in a little bit, in 1966, and then here at Lytton Springs in 1972. And the East Bench Vineyard, it is a single vineyard. It's actually quite close here in Dry Creek Valley to the Lytton Springs Vineyard. And it was a fallow piece of land that we had our eyes on for a long time, and spoke with the owners. It's not a piece of land that we actually own, but they agreed finally around 1999 and 2000 to let us plant the vineyard. So we planted it in two stages in 99 and 2000. It's about a 20-acre vineyard. One of the few vineyards we have which is planted completely to Zinfandel. And we were able to select our own, use our own selections of Zinfandel, and David Gates probably can fill us in a little bit for those who are interested on those in just a bit. But so it's a wine that we, for the first few years, when the vines were very young, it didn't have quite as much concentration as young vines typically don't. So it went into our three valleys, and then 2006 was the first year we made the wine, and we've been making it ever since. And really, what you see, year in and year out as the vines get older is just that increase in concentration and depth of flavor. Really, just when I think of Dry Creek Zinfandel, this is really what I think of. Has some of that nice peppery raspberry aroma on the nose, and then Zinfandel is a grape, of course, which its calling card is fruit. There's a lot of fruit in Zinfandel, which is one of the appealing things about the wine. What's neat about this wine, I think, and what lets you know that you planted Zinfandel in the right place, though, is when you get a little extra something else. You get an extra layer, both in texture here, I think, and a depth of flavor. That sort of red raspberry, typical of Zinfandel, moves over into like blackberry, licorice. So a lot of complexity from the wine. So, we're really happy with the 18. It was a vintage where we had, a few problems just in terms of fruit set in the spring. But what that meant was just fewer grapes on the vine and just added concentration for us. Yeah, I mean, that's, Dry Creek is really known. It's known for Zinfandel, and I think this is one of the reasons why. Um, the East Bench, in terms of how it got its name, it's on the east side of Dry Creek Valley, and it's up on the bench. So it's sort of up above the valley, actually in a relatively flat spot, literally right on top of the hill. Beautiful red soil. Um, really, really a pretty vineyard. David, you want to say a few words, maybe just about the vineyard, soil, the different selections we have?
Absolutely. The vineyard is, like John said, is up on the benchlands above Dry Creek Valley. It's all one soil type. It's called sites, and it's a loamy clay loam soil. It's actually an old riverbed from a long time ago, like maybe between 40 and 80 million years ago. Geologically, that's not too far, too old, but for our purposes, what that means is that it's got kind of stripped soils in terms of they're not too nutrient rich, which is good for grapes. It has some river rock in it, but it's kind of sparse and mostly clay loam. And because it was fallow for many years, it has quite a bit of organic matter in it. And by fallow, the previous owners ran sheep and cattle on it, so they had lots of animals, which is a good thing for that. Making sure that there are enough nutrients available. So these vines are vigorous for us. They grow nicely. It's been really fun watching the vines kind of calm down as they reach their teens, and as they go into their 20s, I expect this wine to become even more serious, showing a little bit more muscle with the tannins. It's night and day difference. It'd be really fun to taste the vertical of this from '06 on, just to see how it's changed. To me, this wine is much more complex. Part of that's the 18 vintage, as John said. It was not as much fruit as we were expecting because we were out of the drought in 18, but with a little bit of weather during bloom, it knocked our yields down about 20%, and that's enough to really gain a lot of concentration. And it was a semi-easy harvest, I remember, in 2018. So we were able to pick everything pretty quickly, and this vineyard is one of the first ones that we pick in Dry Creek Valley, and it gets ripe fast. And the four selections that we have in this ranch are all old vineyards, or from old vineyards that we've worked with for many years. One of them, one's from the Santa Cruz Mountains, the Pichetti Ranch. Some pre-Prohibition vineyards. Another one's from Alexander Valley. That's called Heart's Desire. That's the Old Patch, which we'll be tasting embedded in the Geyserville. The next one is Wine Creek that is from Dry Creek Valley, but it's up on Bradford Mountain, and it's a remnant vine that a little vineyard that Fred Peterson saved, and it's out there as also known as the Hambrook clone. And then the last one is from way up in Mendocino County, and the hills above Anderson Valley, and it's the Ducati vineyard. We call it the Mendocino clone.
So I think we'll do, maybe we'll move on then to our next wine, which is the 2018 Blasi Zinfandel. And this is a fairly new wine for us. We've only been making it for the last 5 vintages, and it's to my knowledge, it's the only wine, certainly Zinfandel, that we've made from Chalk Hill. But one of the nice things about working at Ridge is we have such a loyal fan base that frequently they'll bring in old wines from their cellars to the tasting room, and there's been plenty of times where we'll have customers bring in wines that to be honest, I never knew Ridge actually made. So it's very possible there's another Chalk Hill wine out there I don't know of that Ridge made. But for now, I think this is the only wine we've made from Chalk Hill. And Chalk Hill is it's a small appellation just east and south of Healdsburg that was sort of carved out of Russian River. It's a little warmer than Russian River, but for me, what's neat about this wine is it really has some of that beautiful elegance in the fruit that you get from Russian River, but as well, there's some darkness and some richness, kind of like Dry Creek. So it's sort of a hybrid between the two for me. And the wine gets its name from Gary Blasi, who, along with his father before him, has been farming this vineyard for decades. Very old vines, real classic, head trained vines, pre-prohibition or thereabouts, and primarily Zinfandel with a little bit, just about 3 or 4% Petit Syrah, which is interplanted. Yeah, really a great, just a great fruit expression in the aroma, and just, there's something, I think for me, there's something very seductive about the wine. I mean, it's very, very soft tannins, very approachable. I mean, for me, the 2018 is already drinking really, really well. But again, being a shorter crop, there's a lot of concentration there, really balanced. So it's a wine that, drinkable now for sure, but I think is really going to evolve really, really well in the cellar for 5, 6, 7 years.
John, did you also have a sense for the aging potential for the East Bench? I don't think you'd mentioned that.
Yeah, no, I think the East Bench is definitely something. I think again, being the 18, I think it's probably going to surprise us. I'm thinking for 7 or 8 years it's going to be a beautiful wine, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years it's still drinking really well.
Great. We also have a little bit of a technical question that's been asked about fermentation temperatures. Do you guys have a target you like to see the temperatures of the fermentations at for the Zinfandels?
I think it depends a little bit on a number of things. Certainly, if you're talking about, like, for example, with the East Bench, where I said it's one of the few we make where it's 100% Zinfandel. So you don't have sort of the Petit Syrah factor, which has a lot of tannin in it, sort of baked into to your fermentation. So there, we'll see temperatures go up a little higher, maybe even nudge 90 degrees. With most of the field blends, where there's, you have Alicante or Petit Syrah, it's usually more in the mid 80s is typical fermentation. Eric, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I like a couple days where the temperatures are on the cool side to start off. Once the fermentation's rolling and was in, because of usually the higher alcohol potential, it has that tendency, it wants to ferment really aggressively and fast and get really hot. And if you get it too hot, then you can actually lose some of the beautiful fruit aroma. So we'll put cooling on the fermenters and slow it down. I tend to target 85 to 90. And as John was mentioning, where you've got field blended blocks like we have at Geyserville, you got to really be careful about the temperature, because the warmer it gets, the more extraction you can get. So you can end up over extracting tannin. So it's much more crucial to keep the temperature under control at that point.
Good. Okay. There's maybe another question for David Gates. There's a question that's come up about, the weather and making sure we have the clean fruit to make these beautiful wines. And how do you prevent, issues with rot in Zinfandel, which is obviously a grape that's a little more difficult to control than some of the other varietals. So Dave, how have we been able to have such beautiful fruit these last few years in spite of some challenges?
Well, it's a little bit like real estate, location. You have your vineyards in a really good spot, they especially if they're older vineyards, well, they're there because it is a really good spot, and they have maybe a little bit better drainage, so your vines grow a little bit less vigorously. But we do, you know, kind of all the standard things that you would do. We pull leaves early underneath the vines. Most all of our Zinfandel vines are head trained and spur pruned, so they're little trees, and so you don't really want to pull leaves where the fruit would be directly affected by the sun, because Zinfandel can sunburn very easily too, as well as Petit Syrah. So you want to keep them sheltered a little bit, but you also have to clean around so that you get good airflow in those big head trained vines. So we do interior leaf pulling. We don't really spray any fungicides directly for botrytis unless we have a rain at the toward harvest. But the thing with Zin is you can do all these little tricks to make sure that, and we usually thin later. That's another trick. So you have lots of tricks that you can try on them to keep them from rotting. But when you have a high rainfall year like 2019, or where the berries get very large and the clusters can just kind of internally rot on their own, that's very common with Zin in a wet year. If it rains during harvest before you've been able to pick your Zin, and it's anything over 20 bricks, so it's almost ready to pick, and you get a rain, there's really nothing you can do. With Zinfandel, it will rot. So you basically, the clock starts ticking, and you've got about 7 days to get the fruit off. So you hope that it's with rain, but that's what we try to do, is make sure that we can, pick it before the rain.
Well, and then the other key thing is, since we pick all the fruit by hand, we can have we have a skilled, group of people doing our harvest year after year. We have them pick around the rot. We can also send them out there before we're going to do the harvest and actually take the rotted fruit out first, and then come back and pick the good fruit. So there's a lot of things that we can do and it's expensive. It costs money and time to do that. But that's if you really want to make good, quality wine consistently every year, you make that investment to go out there and just make sure that the grapes we actually harvest and bring to the winery is in good quality as possible. So, okay, good.
And
John,
also we can sort at the winery too.
Yep.
So at Montebello, I have a receiver that we can lay the fruit out over, and then as we're dumping and moving the fruit through, we can pull out any rot. We can look for it and do surgery on clusters if we have to.
Yep. And Dave sometimes himself will stand in the gondola while the grapes are being dumped in there, and then he'll pick any one out that didn't meet the quality standards as well, right, Dave?
Yeah, and I usually throw it at whoever harvested it.
Yeah, there you
Not
go.
always. But,
All right. So, John, anything else on the Blasi or the East Bench wines?
No, I think that's it for now.
Okay. Well, why don't we move over to Eric and let you talk a little bit about the two wines that you've made.
Paso Zin. Well, I do want to say that Blasi, wow. I mean, what a wine. I mean, the fruit was so intense and beautiful on that. The same with the East Bench. I love that. And here we have in the Paso another 100% Zinfandel, just like East Bench. It's just now we moved to a different region, south of Montebello, about 100 or so miles south. And we're dealing with a vineyard that was planted in 1924. So it's a vineyard of old vines, 100% Zin, on a more of a gravel soil. So you've got good drainage, you've got a lot of minerality in the soil. And we generally pick this vineyard first. It's late August is the typical harvest date. It's about a week or two before we move into Sonoma County to begin bringing in fruit from up north. So at being kind of the first fruit of the vintage, we can often put it into our best Zinfandel fermenters, run it through, ferment it, press it off, and then be ready to bring in the Sonoma fruit. And with that, with the type of fermenters that we like to use for Zinfandels is the ones that have a grid system to do submerged cap fermentation, where you keep the skins under the juice for the whole entire time that the natural yeasts are fermenting. that really helps with gentle extraction and just really building more structure into the wine. So we were able to really flesh out this 18 Paso. It's got really good color. I'm gonna pour glass right now. So for a Paso Zin, it's got some really good intensity, tannin structure, acidity as well because of the minerals in the soil. So it's really a pretty distinct and unusual Zin for that region because we are, again, often in that vineyard early on, much before anyone else is picking Zinfandel in that area, because we're really trying to make it in a ridge style, which is more where it's going to ferment dry, it's going to have good acids, good structure, and it's going to be a more complex wine that way. So you can smell it on the nose immediately. It's a Paso Zin. I mean, it's beautiful cherry fruit. You know, it's got a lot of mineral from the soil. And great density. So it's one that I think on the label I write it's going to drink well over a 7-year period of time.
And do you have a contrast between the 17 vintage Paso and the 18 vintage Paso? One of our listeners or viewers was asking about that.
Yeah, you know, the two are very similar. I mean, 17 and 18 being totally different growing seasons. 17 being so wet, 18 being really dry. Ultimately, the wines ended up coming out just about the same with really good density. They're really fleshed out, deep colored, high acid, really atypical of what you would expect for that region. But really wonderful wine, really good concentration, intense flavor. I really see the two as really aging well. Now, the 19, which I have in the cellar right now, I've been looking at, tasting, and really seeing that they're it's actually more of a return to the typical style we get out of the ranch, where it's more fruit forward, really kind of more tropical and red fruit, more medium weight. So the 17 and 18 are really kind of special anomalies of what we generally produce out of that ranch.
And then Eric, there's also a question about in the years that we do make a Ducey, what differentiates or what goes into your deciding to create that Ducey bottling versus the general Paso bottling?
Well, generally for Ducey, it's going to be a block that we weren't able to get to pick fast enough. The thing with that ranch, once it ripens really quickly. And so if there's a break in picking, we may not be able to get back there in time to get the last piece, which could then come out, a full percent higher in ripeness than the main bottling, where there may even be a little bit of residual sugar. So it's going to be really, it's Paso on steroids, full throttle, richer, opulent. It's not, we don't attempt to make that every year. Our ideal is really to make 100% of the ranch past Robles. So in 18, we got in there, we stayed there, we picked it all off, and was able to make it all 100% past Robles. But in 17, I did a small bottling of a Ducey. It actually went so far in ripeness that it made the Essence dessert wine. And then in 19, I've got a small amount again for Ducey Ranch. But 18, being a smaller crop, it was more uniformly ripening, and we were able to get it all off as fast as we could and brought it in.
Great.
I would like to say Benito Ducey passed away last year in 2019. So his nephew, Mike Ducey, and Mike's family have taken over the ranch farming. In fact, Mike had been helping Benny for several years as Benny's health declined. I'm really going to miss Benito. He was a real sweetheart, really, really nice man.
Yeah, and with his nephew now farming it, we can actually go in and pick out a fair amount of fruit in one day and truck it all to the winery fresh. I mean, with Benny, he would only pick so much in a day. We'd have to let it sit overnight. The next day, he'd pick the second half of the trailer, And so we'd be dumping bins of fruit at the receiver, and half the truck would already be sort of fermenting already, from the fruit that was sitting overnight. There was a lot of natural use in that ranch. Yeah, so now it's a little bit easier to control the fermentation, having the fruit all picked fresh and brought to the winery fresh that same day.
Yeah, I think that really underscores, one of the most important things I think for us at Ridge with Zinfandel is that Zinfandel, if you're trying to make a balanced wine, that's not going to be too excessive in terms of sugar and therefore alcohol. It's not that forgiving a grape. That is, the sugars shoot up very quickly. So that's something we put a lot of effort into in terms of logistics and, getting the grapes picked, especially in these wines like Paso and East Bench, where it's 100% Zin. We don't have any of that mixed black, whether it's Petit Syrah and Carignan that comes in at lower sugar to kind of counterbalance that. So the timing of picking is important.
Yeah, and so you got to be in the vineyard early on. As soon as veration's complete, the clusters are all there sitting on the vine, fully colored. You got to start getting samples, tasting, and really getting a reading of ripeness and following it and following the weather pattern, looking at forecasts, anticipating any kind of heat wave, and be willing to step right in and pick before you get any sudden burst of temperature. Because it's those 100+ days that can really change everything about the style of the wine. If you can't pick and it's 100 degrees, the sugars are moving at half a brick a day. So we just watch the two. We tend to pick early on just for the flavor that we're after. We also want to make sure that we have good natural acid in the grape. So the sweeter the grape gets, the lower the acidity becomes in the ultimate wine. And so there's that tendency for us to pick early just so we can ensure that there's good natural acid. Now, when we go to the 18 Geyserville, there's a vineyard. So it's right next to East Bench, Lytton Springs. This is the vineyard right in the west side of the Alexander Valley. So it's not far at all from Lytton Springs. It's about 2 miles. It's a site, though, that the grapes can ripen and maintain very firm acid virtually every year. This is our 53rd vintage. And, big portion of the time, that I've been here at Ridge, that fruit comes in and it's bracing acid to the point where some years we actually have to deacidify it. It's a really quite an unusual site. But it really has a lot to do with the mineral content in the soil, the drainage. It's gravel subsoil, so very alluvial, a lot of calcium as well. And a vineyard that's also heavily interplanted with a lot of Carignan, which is a grape that can ripen and hold all of its acid. So it also contributes additional acid to the Geyserville. So in some of these years, we actually have to sit there and in the fermenter, as we're pumping over and as we're tasting, where there's some really intense acidity, we'll add some calcium carbonate to knock down some of that acid. So it's basically adding, a Tums to the fermenter to bubble out, precipitate some of the tartaric acid. But this being our 53rd vintage, consistently, we've made this wine now since 1966. We have a long history there working that property. It's a great terroir for Zinfandel. And because of the exotic mix of varieties that we have there interplanted with Zinfandel, makes a wine with a lot of dimension, a lot of flavor. It ages extremely well. Again, with our long history working there, you can actually taste back to some of these older vintages where the wine is still standing strong. A couple of years ago, at one of our Montebello events, someone had just gotten a bottle of 68 Geyserville from wine.com, and they brought it up to share, and I was just blown away by how fresh that wine still was tasting. So, I mean, it ages extremely well. And you could say it's because of really the age of the vines that we have there. You know, the older they are, the slower they grow, takes longer for them to ripen. But with that extra hang time, you get much more physiological phenolic ripeness. So you can extract the really ideal type of tannin structure to support long bottle life. And then you have acid on the side of also helping preserve and protect the wine. So that just adds another, you know, few decades worth of aging potential to the Geyserville. But 18, I'd say that the growing season being on the drier side and with the lower yields, because during bloom, the fruit set wasn't as good as what we got in 17 or what we got in 19. You know, we got better intensity in the grapes and really uniform ripening, because the summer of 18, we didn't really have many heat waves. You know, the temperatures remained kind of ideal and perfect for ripening Zinfandel. And that really kind of brought us right into harvest with fruit that was just so perfectly uniform in ripeness. And when you taste the wine, it just really shows that. You know, it's got pristine balance, it's got a lot of depth of flavor. I mean, it's a real classic vintage, as great as some of my favorite vintages of Geyserville. And of course, barrel aged in American oak. So our thing is really, I mean, just keeping that in the cellar, you know, giving it, you know, 15 to 20% new oak, and then metering the rest of the older barrels in so that we get the right proportion of new to old, and then barrel aging it, racking it every 3 months to clarify, you know, not heavily processing, not fining the wine. So it really keeps all the wonderful quality of what we extracted from the grapes really preserved in the wine. So it really stays with it for its life and bottle.
So Eric, if you have a chance just to talk again a little bit about the contribution that the Carignan makes and the contribution to the Petit Syrah, specifically for the Geyserville.
Yeah, so, you know, we have some blocks that are pure Carignan, and these are vines from the 19th century, you know, so that's really special Carignan. They say Carignan, you know, until it's about 100 years old, it's sometimes really tough to work with. They really get it to produce really beautiful quality. But here we have these really old 100 plus, you know, 120, 130-year-old Carignan vines, which, I mean, the wine, I mean, it's so amazing. It's black in color. It's really rich and kind of plum and black cherry fruit, high acid. It's got these really elegant, sensuous tannins. So when it joins the Zinfandel, it really brings in kind of a rounding out effect. It fills in the body of the wine, gives it really good acidity as well. Petit Syrah, which we also are growing there in some distinct blocks on its own, it's usually the very last to come off. It takes longer to ripen. So it actually helps moderate the overall ripeness of the Geyserville, because it will come in at lower sugar, making lower alcohol wine, but it's going to be really dark, really inky. It also has really beautiful tannin structures, so more almost like Cabernet-like tannins, really rich, chalky, fleshy. So in the blend, it helps fill out the body of the wine, give it more tannin structure for aging potential. But then we got all these other exotic grapes that David Gates was able to do a vine survey and find some really unusual and ancient grapes. So maybe David wants to tell us about some of the most unusual things there that he found.
Well, how deep in the woods do you want to go? Besides that, you know, a little bit of Mataro, beautiful vine though. So these aren't super exotic, because Mataro movedra. Mataro being the old California name for what is known around the world now as Movedra, but which its real name is Monastrell, but that's just the Spanish for you. Some beautiful Grenache vines. scattered around. The Alicante is that we have on the label is actually 3 different variants of Alicante, a parent of Alicante, Petit Boucher, and then another offspring, or not offspring, but a sibling of Alicante called Grand Noir. Very common to be mixed in vineyards of Teinturier. Then we get into some other varieties that you find in Alexander Valley and Dry Creek, like Trousseau and Pinot St. George, and a little bit of what growers call Napa Gamay, but which has nothing to do with Gamay. It's Val de Gay. It's another southern French grape, light in color, big berries. Then you can get into the real woods where you find some oddball varieties. A couple of them from Bordeaux. One of them is called Mortal, which we know in California is Cabernet Pfeffer, and we just kind of did that genealogy or naming was just kind of surfaced over the last 2 or 3 years with some work. The oldest vines that we know of Mortal are at the Witten Ranch, but it's mostly grown in San Benito County as Cabernet Pfeffer. Then there's the other one from Bordeaux that we're really excited for is called Saint Macaire, and this was a grape that it's from Bordeaux. It was grown before phylloxera wiped out a lot of the old varieties in Bordeaux, and it makes a highly colored, high acid red wine. So we'll see what it does. We have some in production. We'll see what it does. Another one is from the Jura, and that's called Becklin Noir. That's something that we're very interested in to see what it would do too. And then there's your typical one mission vine. This one happens to be Rose of Peru, so it's a sibling of Mission, and then a few other little ones that I just can't remember, but it's really fun to look at all those.
And Dave, remind us the age of that old patch in the Witten Ranch, the oldest vines.
So planted in the 1890s. It's on St. George rootstock, which really didn't come into California, to use in California until about 1889, 1890, 1891. In the mid-1880s, the big debate was what to do about phylloxera, because it was taking out California vineyards just like it was doing in Europe. And so the debate was whether they wanted to do direct producers, hybrids, French hybrids, or rootstock. So the earliest rootstocks had some St. George, but it also had some direct producers that you find in mostly down in Sonoma Valley. By 1890 or so, everybody realized that St. George was the best rootstock of the ones that were available, and that's when you see vineyards that are really old that are on St. George, that's about the earliest that they could be, would be the early 1890s, late 1880s.
Great. Okay. So Eric.
And it's fun walking through that vineyard just as you're getting close to harvest to be able to taste all these different grapes. It's fun walking down the middle of old patches, a couple rows that are really heavy on the Teinturier varieties. So I call it the Alicante Alley, because it's just Alicante everywhere, the Petit Boucher.
Yeah, it's a really cool ranch.
Yeah.
So Eric, there's a question about where do you think this 2018 Geyserville falls in the spectrum of vintages?
Oh man, I mean, it's a new vintage, so it's of course the greatest one. No.
Right.
I mean, it's a really phenomenal wine. I mean, I love the balance that it has, how deep the flavors are. I'm estimating it's in at least in the top 90% of vintages. It's really going to age well. And again, I mean, our thing is to make balanced wine that can still age, and we're not sacrificing ageability by going towards tannins that are nice and round and supple, like this wine, and we're not heavily processing the wine, so we can actually go to bottle with something that's going to hold up really well for decades.
Yeah, I really think, I mean, to me, it's really, the 18 Geyserville has all of the, the elegance, the raciness that we know we get from the vineyard, but there's a structure to the wine for me that really, I think, promises probably some really long aging.
To me, it's a little bit like the 12, kind of an instant classic. Without
Yeah.
structure. Yeah.
Dave, there was a question about the difference in yields between 17 and 18. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, they were both lower than normal. So kind of depending on where you were in the state, below normal. So 17 was a big rainfall year, but the vines were, especially the older vines, were really still struggling to recover from the drought. So when so I expected to have lower yields. Young vines were fine; they bounced back, and the yields were decent because of the rainfall. In 17, or sorry, in 18, I expected all the vines to come back and actually have a pretty good year. And in fact, the flower primordia, the clustered primordia before they flowered were quite a few and looked really good. But this May weather that affected set really knocked the yields down. So again, about 20% down on our Zins, a little less at Montebello, except the Chardonnay got really hammered. So it kind of depends on where you were. Paso Robles, both years were okay, but they were below normal. So I'd say instead of 20% down on the Zin, they were probably more like 10% down. And yeah, so that's kind of hard to generalize, but I know in other areas like say Lodi, where most of the Zinfandel in California comes from, yields were really good in 17 and a little bit down in 18 again because of those rains.
Great, thanks, Dave. Let's see, there was another question a little bit about, so we were talking about the Witten Ranch and the importance of the Carignan in the Geyserville blend. And Eric had mentioned that there is a block of almost 100% Carignan, but there's also Carignan mixed in, say, the Old Patch or other parts of the vineyard as well. Can you just explain that a little bit more? Yeah.
Oh yeah, so that portion that's interplanted with Zinfandel, what the block we call Old Patch, that's all going to be picked, brought in, and co-fermented, and that is going to lead to such a unique wine that you can't even recreate it if you were fermenting them apart and trying to blend them back to the same percentage. There is this magic of co-fermentation that is almost like alchemy. Where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. It's like you get something totally different because of all the fusion and reactions of the grapes all being together in the same fermenter. You end up with a really intense, really deeply pigmented wine with great flavor. It's like a stew. The longer you cook it, I mean, slower temperature, longer time, it's just going to make something so much more wonderful and multi-dimensional in flavor. And the same is true by co-fermenting the way we do the old block with the interplants. It just, they created the perfect recipe back in the 19th century when they planted those vineyards that way. And what's really cool is that we've repeated that as we've gone in to replant new areas at Geyserville, of starting off with young vines, just recreating that and immediately seeing how wonderful that works. Because generally with young vines, it takes a while before they really kind of prove themselves worthy of joining the top wine. But at Geyserville, those early blocks, those early vintages have made really terrific quality. And so it's really led us down this road of anytime we need to redevelop a parcel at Lytton or at Geyserville, we're going to make these exotic field blended parcels so that the fruit is co-fermenting.
Sounds good. We had, there's one question, pardon me, that I'm going to answer directly. There was a question about alcohol in these wines that we're tasting today. And I was looking on the labels and noticing that these are the wines are all, the East Bench was 14.9, the Blasi was 14.8, the 2018 Paso Robles was 14.8, and the Geyserville was 14.7. So all in a very, very tight range in terms of alcohol for this particular vintage. And just to let people know, our target alcohol for our Zinfandel based wines is around 14.5, 14.5, maybe up to, we like to keep it under 15 if possible. So we found that for most of the wines that we make, we'll get full ripeness and great flavor without going overripe or being, too alcoholic. So that's kind of our target is 14.5, trying not to go over 15. And I think all four of these wines are great examples of that.
Yeah, and it's sometimes challenging with younger, well, especially like East Bench and Paso, you've got the regional effect plus young vines that have that drive, that physiologic, the energy to produce a lot of sugar, but yet the flavors aren't always quite there. And so you're up against picking by taste, but yet you also want to try to keep the alcohol on the low side. And that doesn't always work with young vines. You do have the effect at Geyserville with the fill blend. You've got the grapes all at different stages of ripeness, older vines that ripen slower. And so you can come off at Geyserville at lower 14% alcohol, but then some vintages you can't pick fast enough. If you get warm days during harvest, you often can see the sugar start moving up fast. And, that was kind of 18 and 17 were two of those years where we had heat in the days of harvest. So you have to pick fast.
Yeah, a lot of it, it's not very romantic, but a lot of it comes down to logistics in terms of just, anticipating where you think, based on the weather, the grapes are going to go. And, then, rounding up and prioritizing picking so that you can, so they sort of land in the winery where you want them to be.
Fantastic. Okay. Let's see. I was going to just see if we had any other questions here for the panel. I think there's sort of a general question about consistency. People are commenting on how do we get consistency in the quality of the wines across these different vintages. John, maybe you can talk a little bit about the selection process and what we do to try to make sure we both in terms of sampling and before picking and the harvest decision and then the selection process.
Yeah, I think certainly one of, if maybe not the greatest influences and stamps that Paul Draper has put on Ridge, really, if I had to come up with the top three sort of thing, I mean, the selection process would definitely be at the top. Paul really instills into the philosophy at Ridge that we're gonna bring in every block, we're gonna ferment every block separately, but then after things settle down, they've gone through malolactic, we're gonna go in and we're gonna choose, and we're not gonna be afraid to, if this block just isn't up to the quality in this particular year, then it's not going to go into the particular wine. So, to me, that's probably the just the ability to be able to call out the best blocks for any given year is certainly way up at the top.
So,
yeah, and absolutely. I mean, you see that with, John and I both have a long time here at Ridge, so we know our vineyards, we know the sweet spots that generally make Lytton or Geyserville, East Bench, Paso. But you bring the fruit in, you ferment it carefully. After the vintage is over, then you have to go through and you still have to select. You may have your favorite blocks that you would hope go in, but when it's a blind tasting, you're just tasting the ingredients of that year, and you're going to pick and choose the ones that really stand out best to make that single vineyard wine. And so you have to be willing to give up, you know, 10, 20, 30% of the production of that vintage to make the best example that showcases that beautiful quality or the terroir of that site. So it's a, you know, every year the assemblage tastings are the most fascinating, just to see really the success of the year and just what we think of the different pieces as they came in and fermented and what they ultimately end up, you know, contributing to that single vineyard wine.
Yeah, I think we're also really fortunate at Ridge to be working with, you know, we're working with really great vineyards. In other words, we're working with really great raw materials, and what you know, what you're seeing here today is really, you know, we've been making Paso since '67, Geyserville since '66. You know, what you're seeing are really the vineyards that through trial and error over 5 decades, Ridge has really found to be the most consistent and the best places to be going respective varieties that are being grown there. So, you know, that you know, that stacks the deck in our hands, certainly.
Yeah, and it really does come down to only really investing our time and energy in sites that have really proven themselves to make the most interesting Zinfandel in the style that we want to make. And so, you know, we've been able to step in and farm East Bench, Geyserville, Lytton Springs, and as ourselves being the farmer, being able to really control a lot of the viticultural aspects to really work through the growing season to raise a crop that's going to come into the winery with the essential elements to make great wine. But then even through all that, we have to taste, carefully assemble, and still be willing to leave things out that really don't have the vineyard character showing. And Dave is our farmer, so he's yeah, the one farmer. How many acres do we have up in Sonoma total that we're having to take care of?
A little over 300, 320, 325.
Yeah, so, and Dave, so there's some questions about harvest, like, for example, how many acres can we harvest in one day?
Depends on the yield.
Well, let's say average yield. So how much can we pick in a day?
You know, a really good day for a crew of 50 guys, if the Zin is plentiful like it was last year, they can do 80 tons. They can each do more than a ton a person. Now that's when they've got their sea legs under them, but before they've gotten drowned, right? That's so.
Yeah.
Or it's 100 degrees, right?
Yeah, when it's hot and towards the end of
days.
Well,
we can do, it's like 25 acres.
Yeah. So we pick at night, but what I mean is they have to get used to the rhythm of picking, and then that takes about between 3 days and a week, something like that. Then they're into it, and they're picking fast, unbelievably fast. There's a great YouTube or video on our website that shows real time one of our best pickers, who's also the tractor driver, doing a little run. It's amazing. But there's also, so they can do that for a while, maybe a week, because often when we pick, it's solid. But then they just get tired, and then you need a few days of break, and then they can ramp back up again. So they can do that, but not
forever, not
like
indefinitely. Yeah,
they're not a machine.
No.
What's amazing is they don't cut themselves. I don't know how they do that.
Yeah.
I don't either.
But luckily, it doesn't all ripen at once. I mean, it spreads kind of out over the month of September and into early October.
Yes, and the years that it isn't spread out, that usually the yields aren't that large, so we're scrambling and running around a lot. But anyway, it all seems to work out by hook or crook.
Yeah.
Good. All right. I think we're just about reaching the end of our hour. Any other comments? Maybe a final comment from each of the panelists, and then we'll wrap it up. So, Eric, you're on screen. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I've been really impressed with all the eight. I mean, we're just seeing 4 of them, but, we have in the cellar, both at Lytton and Montebello, probably a total of like 18 different Zinfandels. And what they all have is just this beautiful, sensuous tannin structure. And again, I think it really goes back to the type of growing season we had here, where the fruit was able to uniformly ripen and the tannins were ripe. It just made Zinfandels that have really good sensuous qualities.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, first, thanks to all the viewers for joining us here. There's always a silver lining somewhere, and for me, and I have a feeling a lot of the people watching this will agree. I mean, I've had a lot more time to maybe cook a little something and start digging around in the cellar. So I think there's a lot of people who are rediscovering wines they forgot they had. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Dave, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, it's. I just want everyone to stay safe out there as well as you can, and keep drinking wine. I don't know if it actually helps with virus load or not, but it can't.
I think it does. Yeah.
It certainly makes spending the whole time just locked up with your wife day and night go a little easier. Except, of course, Diane's watching right now. She's going to scream at me. But no, I think having a glass of wine at dinner is, during this time, we can actually go down and spend a little time looking in the cellar and find something that's going to drink really well. And I urge everyone to do that. These are all young wines we tasted here, but in fact, for young wines, I thought they were all showing incredibly well. They'll certainly evolve with time and perhaps improve with some time for sure. But I think one thing that's striking about these 18 vintage wines is that they're all quite enjoyable here as young wines. And someone asked us when did we open these bottles, and I think for probably not more than an hour before we started this broadcast. Maybe Eric, I don't know, you might have opened them sooner, but.
No, I didn't actually. Just like probably 15 minutes.
Yeah,
I did double decant the Geyserville. That
okay.
I did pour kind of back and forth into the little flask, and that really helped open it up.
Yeah, your classic decanter there.
Yeah.
But so again, I think these wines, certainly if you open them up, if you decant them, give them some air as young wines, you're going to really enjoy them. So I think we're gonna conclude our first one of these virtual tastings. Having looked at the comments, some of the comments on the chat, it looks like people have enjoyed this. We are committed to doing these each week between now through the end of April. I don't know if we can keep doing it every single week forever, but I think we'll certainly, we might run out of wines to taste at that rate. But I think we're certainly finding that maybe this is a great way to be in touch with our customers, especially those that can't make it up to our tasting rooms. So we'll think about how we can maybe do this on an ongoing basis, even when we're released from our shelter in place. Now, if you will be able to join us next week, next Thursday, we're going to feature the wines that we call our Heritage Vineyard series. And these are small productions that we make from the Heritage Vineyards at Montebello that all together comprise our Montebello estate. But at Montebello, we actually have 4 separate vineyards that comprise the total estate. And from within that, all those different vineyards, we for the past few years have been making small lots of interesting wines. So if you can join us next week, sign up and we're going to go through and talk about and taste those heritage wines, and you'll get a chance to ask questions and learn a lot more detail about the Montebello Vineyard and what we're doing there. So we look forward to seeing you all again next week. And with that, I think we're going to sign off. So salute and enjoy,
Yeah.
and we'll see you next week.